In just 11 days,
August Storm, a massive invasion of
the Soviet Union wiped out almost 1 million Japanese troops deep in Manchuria.
Most silent companies of infantry and supporting engineers.
Operation August Storm was not just a late war offensive.
through Manchuria's vast plains at incredible speed.
It was calculated payback for the humiliation of 1905.
In fact, the Soviet Manchuria campaign was a long-planned operation.
Executed with a kill ratio of roughly 30 to 1. The campaign shattered what was left of Japan's military strength, helped push their leadership toward surrender.
The men of an army 1 million strong were about to be taken completely by surprise.
And erased a 40-year national wound in less than 2 weeks. It remains one of the fastest and most decisive operations in modern warfare. Subscribe to No Man's Land for more untold war stories delivered with full detail and accuracy. History often remembers the moment of victory, but rarely the wound that created the need for it. Long before Soviet tanks rolled into Manchuria in 1945, before deep battle tactics and mechanized spearheads shattered Japanese positions, this story began with an injury to national pride that no Russian government could ignore. In 1905, the Russian Empire suffered a defeat so complete that it echoed across revolutions, toppled dynasties, and survived into the ideology of its successor. The Russo-Japanese War had shown the world an event considered unthinkable for centuries. An Asian power defeating a European empire in a modern conflict. The memory of that loss followed Russia like a shadow. The pain began at Port Arthur, when Japanese forces launched a surprise attack in February 1904. Over the next year, Russian command failures, poor equipment, and a rigid hierarchy led to disaster. At the Battle of Mukden, some 300,000 troops clashed in what was then the largest land battle in history. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but Russia crumbled and withdrew in humiliation. Then came Tsushima in May 1905. After sailing nearly 18,000 nautical miles to relieve their forces, the Russian Baltic Fleet was met by a Japanese navy, far more modern and capable. What followed was not a battle, but annihilation. The Japanese sank or captured almost the entire fleet, while suffering minimal losses. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in modern warfare. The Treaty of Portsmouth cemented Russia's defeat. Territory was lost, influence in Asia was shattered, and the humiliation became embedded in the Russian identity. It sparked revolution at home, forced concessions from Tsar Nicholas II, and demonstrated the consequences of outdated doctrine and stagnant leadership. That defeat did not fade with time. It survived the fall of the monarchy, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and the birth of the Red Army. Soviet military doctrine itself grew in the shadow of 1905, built with one goal: never again. The chance to erase that humiliation finally arrived 40 years later. And when it did, the Soviets would not simply win. They would destroy their enemies so completely that the defeat of 1905 would be rewritten in fire. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese Kwantung Army still carried the reputation of being one of the most feared ground forces in Asia. It had once been seen as the symbol of Japanese might. On the mainland, ruthless, aggressive, and instrumental in expanding Japan's control across Manchuria. In the 1930s, its officers fabricated pretexts for invasion, engineered political upheaval without Tokyo's approval, and seized territory with near impunity. They built the puppet state of Manchukuo and operated almost as a militarized government of their own. At its peak, the force represented roughly 700,000 men, including well-equipped divisions, cavalry, and elite infantry units. It was designed to intimidate, expand, and hold strategic ground across northeastern Asia. But what existed on paper in August 1945 was not the same army that had once terrorized the region. Years of war against the United States and its allies had drained Japan's resources. As the Pacific Campaign intensified and American forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, Tokyo redirected its best divisions, armor formations, and veteran officers away from Manchuria to defend against defeat elsewhere. What remained behind was hollow. Of the Kwantung Army's 25 divisions, only about 6 were considered capable of effective combat. Many units were filled with undertrained conscripts, men pulled from support roles, and reservists with minimal preparation. A significant percentage of units existed only on organizational charts. The equipment shortage was even more dire. The Army maintained just over 1,500 tanks, most of them outdated Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha models, lightly armored and grossly underpowered compared to modern Soviet armor. Artillery numbered around 6,700 pieces, but many guns lacked ammunition. The air component, roughly 1,800 aircraft, was largely grounded due to fuel shortages. In contrast, Soviet forces would attack with thousands of tanks and nearly 4,000 combat aircraft. Worse still, the Kwantung Army was trapped in outdated doctrine. Defensive planning still reflected World War I concepts: linear lines, static fortifications, and rigid positions. Deep mobile warfare, the very style perfected by Soviet forces, was either ignored or considered unattainable due to lack of resources. The Japanese command knew the Soviets were stronger, but could not adapt. They were preparing for a type of war that no longer existed, and they were about to face an enemy that had mastered the one that did. To understand why Operation August Storm unfolded with such overwhelming force, it is necessary to look at how the Soviet Union prepared for it. Unlike the exhausted and resource-starved Kwantung Army, the Red Army entered this campaign as one of the most battle-tested military machines in history. By 1945, Soviet forces had endured 4 years of brutal conflict against Germany, the strongest military power in Europe. They had learned through fire what worked and what failed. Every lesson from Stalingrad, Kursk, and the drive into Berlin was applied to the upcoming offensive in Manchuria. The operation would not just be large, it would be executed with precision and speed, leaving no space for recovery. The overall plan was authored by Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, a strategist recognized for coordinating the final offensives against Nazi Germany. For Manchuria, he oversaw 3 coordinated fronts, each advancing from different directions, designed to break Japanese defenses simultaneously and prevent any chance of regrouping. The Trans-Baikal Front, commanded by General Rodion Malinovsky, deployed around 416,000 troops, more than 1,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 5,000 artillery pieces, and 4,400 aircraft. From the east, General Kirill Meretskhov's First Far Eastern Front advanced with roughly 586,000 troops, 1,550 armored vehicles, 7,400 artillery pieces, and 1,360 aircraft. The Second Far Eastern Front, under General Maxim Purkayev, added another 337,000 troops, 600 tanks, and 4,200 artillery units. In total, the Soviets amassed over 1.6 million soldiers, between 3,000 and 5,500 armored vehicles, nearly 17,000 artillery pieces, and roughly 3,700 aircraft. These were not inexperienced men. Many had fought from the Don River to the streets of Berlin. Their equipment was proven. T-34/85 and IS-2 tanks were reliable, mobile, and powerfully armed. Soviet air divisions used modern Yak-9, La-5, and La-7 fighters, with the Il-2 Sturmovik providing devastating ground support. Logistics, refined across thousands of kilometers of grueling advances, ensured that fuel and ammunition reached forward units as they pushed deep into enemy territory. Japan prepared for a slow advance. What they would face instead was a storm unlike anything they had ever encountered. The plan was not simply to defeat the Kwantung Army, it was to erase it. By 1945, Soviet High Command no longer viewed war as a matter of pushing the enemy back line by line. Their doctrine, known as deep operations, focused on breaking an army from within, cutting its ability to fight rather than its physical positions. Instead of concentrating on the front line, Soviet attacks aimed at the enemy's rear, communications, supply nodes, and command infrastructure. Their goal was total collapse. This doctrine had been refined against the Germans after disastrous early failures in 1941. 4 years of relentless adaptation shaped the Red Army into the most advanced operational force in modern warfare. That evolution would now be used against the Japanese. The Japanese defensive model remained rooted in a belief that war was static and positional. They prepared for frontal assaults, constructing bunkers, pillboxes, trenches, and fortified lines. These fortifications relied on the assumption that enemy forces would try to dislodge them head-on. But deep battle bypassed such strong points. Soviet maneuver groups, composed of tanks and mechanized infantry, would strike through weak spots and move rapidly past resistance. Anything not immediately threatening would be ignored until follow-on forces handled it. By the time a defensive unit realized it had been bypassed, Soviet tanks would already be in their rear, cutting supply routes and communications. 3 simultaneous advances, one through Mongolia and across the greater Khingan Mountains, one from the east toward the coast, and one from the north, created a dilemma that Japanese doctrine could not solve. If they concentrated forces to block one thrust, they risked being encircled by another. If they tried to hold everywhere, they became too weak to stop anything. Their doctrine called for fixed defense, but the war demanded mobility they did not possess. Even the terrain the Japanese relied upon as protection favored the Soviets. The Greater Khingan Range was considered impassable for tanks. Soviet engineers proved otherwise. They surveyed routes, stockpiled fuel, and prepared vehicles for heat and altitude. When the operation began, tank columns crossed terrain Japanese planners believed would slow any attacker for weeks, within days. Lightly defended positions didn't hinder them. They vanished under mechanized pressure. Japanese officers were prepared for war, as they had known it. What arrived instead was war as they had never imagined it. Fast, flexible, and unstoppable. The objective wasn't to capture ground. It was to ensure there were no effective defenders left to hold it. For decades, the Kwantung Army had been seen as the embodiment of Japanese military power in Asia. Once feared for its aggression and tactical dominance, it was credited with initiating the occupation of Manchuria and shaping Japanese expansion ambitions. But like many legends, its reputation far outlived its strength. By the summer of 1945, what Tokyo called its elite Continental Army was largely a shadow of its former self. Undertrained, under-equipped, and strategically misaligned for the war it was about to face. On paper, the Kwantung Army fielded roughly 700,000 men. In reality, only around 600,000 were physically present, and only a fraction of those were trained or fit to fight. Many divisions consisted of conscripts pulled directly from civilian life with minimal preparation. Others were rear echelon support units, repurposed as combat infantry. Veterans who had survived earlier campaigns were rare. Most experienced troops had long ago been redeployed to desperate defensive fronts in the Philippines, Okinawa, and even the Japanese home islands to brace for the expected American invasion. What remained in Manchuria were units that existed more on organizational charts than on the battlefield. Equipment was equally inadequate. The army still relied on obsolete Type 97 Chiha and Type 95 Hago tanks, machines effective in China during the 1930s but utterly incapable of stopping modern Soviet armor. Their cannons could barely scratch T-34s or IS-2's heavy tanks. Artillery was limited, ammunition rationed, and logistics crippled by fuel shortages. Most Japanese aircraft were grounded due to fuel scarcity, while the Red Army deployed thousands of modern fighters and ground attack aircraft. But beyond hardware, the real weakness lay in doctrine. Japanese defensive planning remained rooted in World War I-era concepts, rigid lines and fixed fortifications, with no operational reserves, no capacity to respond flexibly, and no mechanism to counter deep penetration strategies. Morale was breaking even before the first Soviet shells landed. Soldiers knew Japan was losing. Cities back home were burning from American firebombing. The Navy was destroyed. Food was scarce, even in Manchuria. Some units still trained with wooden rifles. Officers waited for a decisive last stand, but no one expected one to succeed. A Japanese staff officer later wrote that they understood defeat would come not from battle, but from inevitability. When Soviet armor broke through multiple fronts simultaneously, the Kwantung Army's collapse was not dramatic resistance. It was accelerated disintegration. They were facing a modern army with 20th century warfare, using tactics designed for the previous century. Their failure was not in their courage. It was in their preparation for a war that no longer existed. Soviet commanders did not intend to simply defeat the Kwantung Army. They set out to erase it from the battlefield. The doctrine they employed, known as deep operations, was forged in 4 brutal years against the Germans. It transformed overwhelming strength into unstoppable momentum. Instead of pushing forward on a single axis and grinding through defenses layer by layer, Soviet forces attacked across multiple fronts at once, punching holes through Japanese lines and driving directly into the rear areas before their enemy even understood where the main assault was coming from. Behind the initial infantry and artillery waves came operational maneuver groups, fast-moving tank and mechanized infantry formations designed to bypass fortified positions and strike deep, isolating entire sectors of the Japanese army. On August 9, 1945, 3 Soviet fronts, the Transbaikal, 1st Far Eastern, and 2nd Far Eastern, launched their assault simultaneously. The Japanese had expected a slow advance, believing terrain would stall mechanized forces, particularly through the Greater Khingan Mountains. But Soviet engineers had spent weeks preparing mountain passes. Tanks pushed through arid ranges considered impassable for heavy armor. Soldiers worked through the night clearing obstacles, constructing bridges, and marking routes. Entire armored battalions crossed mountain sectors at speeds some Japanese reports described as impossible to comprehend. One Soviet tank crew member later said, "We expected resistance. What we found instead was silence." In some areas, Soviet spearheads advanced more than 150 kilometers in a single day. The pace shattered Japanese command ability. Headquarters lost radio contact with forward units within hours. Attempts to form secondary defensive lines were futile. By the time orders reached divisions, Soviet tanks were already beyond their position. Japanese soldiers, trained to hold ground, now faced enemies bypassing and surrounding them, cutting off retreat paths before firing a single shot. Soviet artillery and aviation targeted communication hubs, supply depots, and rail junctions, ensuring Japanese forces were isolated before they could even organize. The contrast with European combat was astonishing to Soviet veterans. Against the Germans, they had fought meter by meter. In Manchuria, Japanese positions collapsed before meaningful resistance could form. Deep battle tactics had evolved into operational annihilation. For many Japanese troops, the war was over before the first engagement. The Soviets did not defeat their defenses. They made them irrelevant. By the third day of the offensive, Soviet forces were already operating deep behind Japanese lines, seizing cities, rail junctions, and logistical hubs the Kwantung army depended on to function. What remained of the Japanese defense was fragmented and directionless. Headquarters staff attempted to relay orders, but communications were broken across the entire command chain. Field units reported hearing Soviet tank engines long before receiving any instructions from superiors. Some garrisons fought blindly, believing they were still holding front-line positions, only to discover Soviet forces had bypassed them hours earlier, cutting their retreat and isolating them in place. Japanese defensive doctrine centered around fixed positions and controlled withdrawals, but deep operations denied them both. Units that attempted to fall back found Soviet armor and mechanized infantry already waiting at their fallback points. Others tried to dig in along river lines and ridge tops, but lacked heavy weapons to compete with Soviet artillery superiority. Entire formations, division-sized at times, were caught mid-move and encircled. Japanese war diaries recovered after the campaign refer to attacks from all directions at once, enemy forces appearing behind us without firing a shot, and total disruption of basic command logic. On paper, the Kwantung army still numbered around 700,000 men at the start of the campaign, yet the true effective force was far smaller. Many troops were poorly trained conscripts, deployed to remote sectors with inadequate supplies. Thousands had only days or weeks of preparation. When Soviet offensives struck, their weapons jammed, machine guns overheated, and ammunition ran out within hours. Few surviving officers had real combat experience, and many who did had already been sent to fight in the Pacific. Leaders were left with units unable to mount coordinated resistance, much less carry out counterattacks in accordance with doctrine. Soviet spearheads covered an average of 40 to 70 kilometers per day, a pace unmatched even in their operations in Germany. In some sectors, tank columns advanced over 800 kilometers in less than 2 weeks. Japanese troops described the experience as a storm that moved with no front and no rear. Attempts to reorganize against the assault dissolved instantly under the pressure of constant movement. The few defensive engagements that did occur were short-lived, often lasting minutes rather than hours. By August 15th, the Imperial broadcast announcing Japan's surrender filtered through collapsing sectors. Soldiers who had still been engaged in firefights minutes earlier laid down their weapons. Many officers committed suicide rather than face the shame of capture. Others gathered small detachments for final resistance efforts that ended in futility. Soviet advances did not slow. They continued to encircle and capture remaining forces until August 20th, by which time the Kwantung army had effectively ceased to exist. Command had collapsed. Survival replaced fighting. In just 11 days, what was once considered Japan's most prestigious army had been dismantled, not through attrition, but through total operational collapse. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, his message crackled through radio waves across a shattered nation. But in Manchuria, most Japanese troops never heard it. Soviet assaults were still hammering through sectors, communications had collapsed, and many command posts had already fallen. Some officers thought the broadcast was psychological warfare. Others received it hours later, but by then their units were already surrounded. In certain areas, field commanders attempted to confirm the surrender through Tokyo, but their radio units were either destroyed or cut off. Some regiment leaders resorted to passing written notes by runners, many of whom never made it through Soviet lines. Entire battalions continued fighting for days simply because no one remained to tell them the war had ended. Many Japanese soldiers were too exhausted or disoriented to comprehend what surrender meant. They had been moving non-stop, chased from one defensive line to the next, overwhelmed by Soviet armor that appeared ahead of them before firing even began. One diary entry recovered after the war reads, "Our maps no longer match the land. The enemy controls places before we mark them." When Soviet aircraft dropped surrender leaflets, some troops accepted them immediately and laid down their rifles. Others burned them. Officers, bound by pre-war doctrine demanding fight to the death, often chose suicide. Those who attempted breakout attacks toward supposed rallying points found Soviet tanks already waiting. In some last engagements, the fighting ended not with resistance, but with silence as Japanese units walked out of the brush and surrendered without a word. Communication had failed, resolve had cracked, and survival replaced all strategy. Operation August Storm ended officially on August 20th, but the consequences were only beginning. Soviet forces recorded roughly 12,000 total casualties, with around 2,300 killed. Japanese losses exceeded 80,000 killed, over 15,000 wounded, and between 594,000 and 650,000 taken prisoner. On paper, this was a military triumph, with one of the most lopsided kill ratios in modern history. For the Soviets, it was more than a strategic victory. It was a historic correction. Commanders raised the red banner over Port Arthur, the same fortress whose capture in 1905 had humiliated Russia. This time there was no siege. The Japanese garrison surrendered immediately. Soviet officers said the moment symbolized Tsushima reversed. Every piece of land ceded 40 years earlier was now retaken. But while the national wound was closed, another opened. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese prisoners were sent to labor camps in Siberia, where many would die from exposure, exhaustion, and disease. Survivors described it as a second war with no weapons. Some did not return to Japan until 1956. Families waited 11 years for their sons to walk home, and many never did. For the Soviets, deep battle had proven unstoppable. For Japan, the collapse was absolute. Operation August Storm did not just end an army, it ended the last belief that courage alone could stand against modern war. In 11 days, a historical debt of 4 decades was repaid. But it was paid in lives, and the echoes of that repayment lasted decades longer than the campaign itself.